We fought two parallel counteroffensives, one south of the equator, one north of the equator. And the Japanese really were unable to concentrate their diminishing forces.
Some people decide, okay, if we're going to surrender, then that means I need to do my final kamikaze run. And other people are saying like, oh my God, thank God. The people in Hiroshima saying, this actually makes me feel even worse that we're surrendering after the nuclear bomb drop.
It's almost as if the Japanese army took over the entire country, not just in terms of running the schools, but in terms of running the culture.
Ian Toll is the author of the Pacific War trilogy, a 3-volume history of the Pacific Front of World War II. The final volume, Twilight of the Gods, came out 5 years ago, which is an anniversary. That's all the excuse we need to have Ian on ChinaTalk. The Pacific War trilogy is one of the most impressive pieces of writing and scholarship I've ever come across. Ian has one of the most remarkable eyes for detail that I've seen in reading history, and is able to supply clear-headed thinking and a literary sensibility up and down the levels of warfare, everything from tactical dilemmas of sub-commanders and infantry landings to admirals discussing operational strategy and FDR negotiating with Churchill and defining the terms of Europe first. The narrative feels modern and timeless, and as perhaps the highest compliment I can give to general history, has already inspired me to start 5 other books on the themes Ian opened up. Everything from the minutiae of the Midway duel to the broken acquisitions process for torpedoes, Okinawa artillerist memoirs, and Japanese imperial politics. So thank you so much, Ian, for your scholarship. And thanks so much for joining us here today on ChinaTalk.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Co-hosting today, Chris Miller. So I want to start with your closest scholarly forebearer of sorts, Samuel Eliot Morison. He was FDR's buddy who ended up getting presidential approval to be embedded in the fight in the Pacific. And over the next 20 years, he ended up publishing a 15-volume, 6,000-page history of the United States naval operations in World War II. So in preparing for this show, aside from reading your 2,000 pages, I also read a few hundred pages of Morison, which, while there are echoes, feels like it was very much of a different time and a different era and different audience. So when kind of reflecting back at where you chose to spend your time in research and pages, kind of comparing to what he thought was most interesting and vital, what were the sorts of things that you both agreed upon, kind of needed the full treatment? What were things that you felt comfortable writing this in the 21st century that you could spend less time on? And what were some of the themes that you wanted to emphasize to a greater extent than what he did in his book?
Sure. Okay. Well, Morison is, will always be, if not the greatest historian of the Pacific War, he was certainly the first. And it's an unusual case, really, because what Morison did was he pitched the president of the United States, who was himself a former assistant secretary of the Navy. This is FDR. He was assistant secretary of the Navy, essentially running the Navy day to day during the Woodrow Wilson administration, and was also a sort of a fascinated with the history of the Navy going all the way back to the American Revolution. He was a collector. He was an antiquarian. And so he was, unique as a president in anticipating the importance of research and writing to write the history of this war even before it began to unfold. He recognized just how important that was going to be. And so Samuel Eliot Morison, a historian at Harvard, well established in the field, says, why don't you just put me in charge of this whole project and let the Navy know that I get all access, essentially an all access pass to the Pacific War as it's happening. And I will produce a multi-volume, you can call it an official history, but really it'll be a history written by me, Samuel Eliot Morison, with all of my strongly opinionated views, having witnessed many of these events, in some cases from actually being aboard a ship in a task force as it went into battle. And so, Morison's concern was to write the first draft of the history, and he did a remarkable job of that. He had access in a way that really no outsider could possibly have had access. He became personal friends with many of the admirals who fought that war, and then was a direct witness to many events. And that was true in Okinawa, for example, where he was aboard a ship in the task force and could work his personal impressions into the narrative. So anyway, all of that is very unique. What did Morrison do? Well, he was seeing the war through the eyes of the contemporaries. He was very much involved in the debates that the admirals had as they were rolling across the Pacific. So I think he was probably less interested than I am in the way that the war was experienced by the ordinary sailor, soldier, airman, and it was much more interested in grand strategy. I like to pull those together. The way the war unfolded in the eyes of those who fought it, but then also returning to the rooms where the conference rooms and where the planning unfolded. And then, I really wanted to understand how the politics of, for example, the politics of inter-service rivalries in the U.S. military, how that affected decisions, because that was an important story, uniquely, I think, in the Pacific because of the divided command structure. I'm sure we'll get into that. This decision to essentially make this sort of Solomon-like decision to say the South Pacific will be MacArthur's domain. The U.S. Army will be in charge of the South Pacific. The Central and North Pacific will be Nimitz's domain. So we're really going to divide this enormous ocean into two theaters. We're going to let the Navy have one, let the Army have one. That was to establish a certain amount of peace within this, large and fractious military. And in some ways, that was the suboptimal decision. In other ways, it seemed to work out fine because the United States had the ability to mobilize such an enormous war machine that we could essentially fight two wars in the Pacific, which is what we did. We fought two parallel counteroffensives, one south of the equator, one north of the equator. And because we had the ability to do that, the Japanese really were unable to concentrate their diminishing forces to meet either prong of this two-headed offensive.
So I guess, as you're thinking about how to devote your research time and the pages that you allocate to these stories, can you reflect a little bit about your process of sort of like having all these simultaneous strains of the experiences of these individual soldiers, as well as these sort of grand debates between MacArthur and Nimitz and the president about how to kind of like put all the pieces on the chessboard? What was both the research as well as synthesis process for you of really trying to do this comprehensive history?
Yeah, my process really from when I first began doing this about 25 years ago is to essentially read everything. Now, with the Pacific War, you can't literally read everything. First book I wrote, Six Frigates, about the founding of the U.S. Navy, I felt at times like I was touching almost pretty much everything that had been written. That will never be the case with a war this big. But to read very, very widely. And so, it's histories, it's the original documents, the planning documents, the action reports, and the memoirs, the letters of the military commanders, of the lowest ranking soldier and sailor who experienced these. So to really cast a very wide net and to spend years, really before sitting down to write in going out and just gathering up an enormous amount of material, really looking at the subject from every different angle. And then there's a middle step, which I think is really important. And I think, often is neglected, I think, by a lot of people who do this, which is to take all of that material and to put it into a sort of a place to file it in a way that when you come back to the part of the narratives that you're writing, you can immediately put your hands on that source to work it in. And so it really is, it's a basically an information management issue, which requires, a lot of thinking about how not just to do the research initially, but to organize it so that you can then use it in the writing. And then eventually it just becomes, many thousands of documents organized in a certain way, a narrative which is going to unfold. The narrative is iterative in the sense that, I may go down a blind alley and decide I need to throw that out. I throw hundreds of pages out. I'm doing it again with the book I'm writing now. And to try to, give the reader a sense that you're shifting between different perspectives constantly. So the perspective of Nimitz and his staff in Pearl Harbor planning an operation, and then shifting immediately to the perspective of, Marines in the 5th Regiment who are landing on a beach and then carrying out the operation that you had just seen how this was planned, and then shifting to the Japanese perspective, and shifting back to the U.S. to the home front. So a constantly shifting narrative in which you're sort of looking at the same subjects from a different point of view, but then integrated into a narrative that kind of unspools a little bit the way a novel would. So
how did you learn to do that, shifting of perspective so smoothly? Because it's easy to say, shift from Nimitz's room where he's looking at the map, then shift to Iwo Jima or wherever. But you do that in a way that few narrative histories do. And I think, Jordan and I both agreed that we've, never read a 2,000-page history and wanted another page until we read yours. And so how do you learn that scene shifting? What were you looking at as examples? What were you reading that gave you a model for this type of vast, sweeping narrative history?
And I just want to give the audience a bit of a sense of like what this is that Ian does. One of my favorite scenes actually came right at the end in the way that you handled Hirohito's surrender speech, where you have this narrative that takes place over 30 pages of, first, we have this debate of whether or not to surrender in the first place. And then these 10 pages of incredible sort of like palace drama of, is there's going to be a coup? There was a coup and it kind of failed. And then we're going to NHK and the phonograph is literally being placed and the guy bows at the emperor's photograph. And then you have these scenes of all across the sort of imperial Japan, different people kind of responding to hearing the emperor's voice in different ways. And it's this archaic Japanese, so people didn't even know what it's saying. And some people decide, okay, if we're going to surrender, then that means I need to do my final kamikaze run. And other people are saying like, oh my God, thank God. The people in Hiroshima saying, this is actually makes me feel even worse that we're surrendering after the nuclear bomb dropped. And this sort of, it sounds overwhelming and kaleidoscopic, but is actually one of the most kind of incredible like pieces of literature that I have consumed. So maybe, just that as an aside. Where does that all come from, Ian? How do you develop this skill?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the praise. It's fuel that kind of keeps me going because this is hard work, and so I appreciate that. But really, if you look at my career, I've been doing this full time since 2002. That's when I signed my first book contract. So that's 23 years, and I have 4 books to show for it. So that's part of the answer, is that I take a lot of time. I throw a lot of work out. Probably a lot of that work is pretty good, but it didn't kind of work within the narrative pacing that I was going for. So it's a lot of following instinct. I think I said in an author's note at one point that there's room for innovation, I think, in this genre of historical narrative. It's been a genre that has been, I think, trapped within certain kind of ideas about conventions, narrative conventions. An idea that if you use some of the storytelling techniques that you'd find in a novel or even a film, for example, that you might be compromising the scholarly purpose of the work. And I I don't believe that that's true. I think that you can, borrow from the techniques of novels, or dare I say it, even films, in a way that may even illuminate certain issues that you're writing about, that may bring the reader a little closer to the way it felt for the participants to be there. So I think the answer is, I take a lot of time, I throw a lot of work out, and I really just try to follow a storytelling instinct, um, in using research that I've really accumulated over many years, and have cast a very wide net to try to find material that maybe hasn't received as much attention as it should have in previous works.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that filmic quality, because I think that's sort of one of the other pieces I'm really left with after reading this. Is there are these moments of sort of like terrific, awe-inspiring beauty, that you point to, of these ships blowing up, and these, massive artillery barrages, and, just to point another one at the close, like this sunrise over Mount Fuji that the admirals see as they're sort of pulling into the harbor, about to accept the surrender of the Japanese, and kind of the way that they see that as, this flag that they've been fighting against and, finding on people's corpses for the past 6 years. Your book made me like watch some more World War II specific movies, and I was kind of disappointed, honestly, with what I saw relative to the sort of incredible Technicolor visions that you and your narrative painted in my head. So yeah, well, more on that, the visuals. How did you sort of develop that sensibility, and when did it become clear to you that you needed to make sure that try to have your readers have some of the images that were in these soldiers' heads, in ours as well?
Yeah, well, I think as I'm combing through these sources, I often zero in on these images, descriptions of images, and one of the things you'll find if you start reading Pacific War narratives, again and again, you will have an American from southern Illinois who had never really traveled beyond a few miles where he was born, seeing these extraordinary things in the Pacific, this extraordinarily exotic, remote part of the world. And often what they'll pause to describe are the sunsets. And they'll just try to describe the sunsets, but then you'll get a sense that they really are having this kind of sublime, ineffable experience, seeing these things. And so I think that just grabs my attention when I see that. And then I want the reader to kind of see that image, but then also get a sense of how that felt, for people who had not traveled widely, before being thrown into this extraordinary war. And on that subject, there's a whole kind of genre of art, wartime art. You have talented watercolorists, working, on a destroyer, who took a sketchbook along and brought back images, which are particularly important because you weren't really permitted to take a camera with you along in the Pacific War. You had to have special authorization to have a camera. And so the art sometimes actually is useful, not just in depicting these images, but in seeing the war through the eyes of the people who were there. So I guess the answer really is that those aspects of the Pacific War narratives always jumped off the page, for me, and then I tried to in turn weave them into the narrative.
So there's beauty and there's also horror.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of time describing deaths. And even when people aren't literally dying, the sort of like smell of some of these battlefields and the smell of the corpses is another thing that's going to live with me for a while. So yeah, I mean, that contrast really struck out, of these incredible sunsets and these sort of spectacular displays of like mechanical might and fleets that like are extending farther than the eye can see, and then every once in a while they blow up and people die these horrific deaths because of what all these machines can do. So yeah, how you tried to do justice to that as well is a question I had for you.
Well, really, in the case of the Pacific War or any other war, really any other aspect of World War II, there's plenty of carnage in the historical record. These things happened, and so really, it just becomes the challenge becomes to describe those in a way that gives the reader just a kind of a sense of what it was like to be there. And you're right on the smell. I mean, that's another thing that just jumps off the page. If someone describes a smell, whether it's, the kind of awful smells that you get on a battlefield or, even this smell of flowers on a beach. I mean, those tend to leap out at me. And then I try to find a way to work those in. We have five senses. If you can get 3 out of 4, of the physical senses into a description of a battle scene, you're able to sort of reach the reader through more than one route, and I just think that those images, those impressions, they tend to build on themselves, and if you can get many of them into a narrative, not doing what a novelist does, where you make it up, you actually need to pull these things from firsthand accounts that are reliable. But if you get many of them, I think that tends to build on itself a little bit, where you get a much more of a the reader gets much more of a sense of, I think I see what it was like to be there. I spent a lot of time thinking about that.
This is my
that's
big
such
note
a good
for
piece
Chris.
of advice.
This is my big note for the Chip Wars revised edition, Chris. We need more smell in it, please.
It's the place where that really stood out for me in the book was on Iwo Jima, which everyone knows is kind of this absolute bloodbath. But the discussion of the sulfuric, kind of volcanic ash all around in these subterranean caves, like you got smells and also even tastes at a certain point. You talk about the water being sulfuric in its taste. It sort of felt like I was walking into Mordor, but it wasn't made up in Tolkien's mind. It was a real hellhole on Earth.
Oh my God. And the real smell the real taste that's going to live with me forever is the Enola Gay dropping the bomb, and the pilots taste metal because of the radiation. And that's, they hadn't looked back, but they knew that, the bomb had gone off because they felt it in their molars. I mean, what more can you ask for from a historian? Oh.
Yeah,
so I wanted to ask.
That detail really grabbed my attention too when I read it. And that's in one of the pilot accounts, I believe. And I wasn't aware that happened, but you've had this electric taste in your mouth from the explosion of the bomb, and that they noticed that at the Trinity test, the first atomic bomb test in New Mexico as well.
So I wanted to ask, Ian, you have these juxtapositions of extraordinary heroism and extraordinary barbarism on both sides in basically every battle. I think a lot of military histories tend in one direction or the other and don't balance out both. And you show them both being constantly present in different ways, competing impulses. Can you walk us through kind of the, I don't know, morality is the right word, but the ethics of what you're recounting and how you as a historian try to properly balance these two competing impulses?
You mean the impulses to acknowledge the humanity and suffering of the enemy, but then also, I mean, it is part of what makes war interesting in general, I think, and war histories, good war history, war narratives, memoirs, is that you have a situation in which it's literally impossible for people on the battlefield not to feel a sense of hatred toward the enemy. This is murder on a mass organized scale. And then you have a war like the Pacific War, which in some ways that hatred reached a sort of a pitch that we haven't seen, at least in any other American war. I think the kind of the dehumanization and the hatred that was felt, much of it justified, honestly. So to evoke that for the reader, that sense of hatred, that kind of sense that many Americans had, that the Japanese were somehow less than fully human, and that justified wiping out their cities. To feel that in a visceral way for the reader, because of the way that you've showed the way the war was experienced by the Americans who experienced it, by the POWs, by the civilians who were caught in the war zone in the way of rampaging Japanese armies, but that at the same time to acknowledge, to understand fully the humanity of the Japanese and the suffering of the Japanese. And so really it I think it just comes down to weaving these different perspectives together into one integrated narrative. And many others have done it well. You guys might have read John Toland's book, The Rising Sun. If you haven't, I recommend it. He was one of the first, I think, to write the history of that war as a Westerner, but to really write it from the Japanese perspective in a way that was, broadly sympathetic to the Japanese as people. The Japanese militarists had tyrannized and abused that country, and eventually brought on the immense suffering of 1944 and 45.
Jordan, do you want to go to the kind of suicide dynamics and kamikaze dynamics, or where do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think this, the kamikaze dynamics of the so the kamikaze dynamics that we get into in 1944 and 45, I think, are some of the most artful. I'm saying everything's good because the whole book was really good. This section, you sort of lead it up. I think it was even 2 books before, talking about the sort of training dynamics of Japanese airmen, where they had this like incredibly harsh fraternity where 1,000 people joined and only 100 made it out on the outside, and that led to this very elite corps of fighter pilots. But ultimately they were sort of short of decent pilots, such that your pilots were so useless by 42 and 43 that the most you could like the quote unquote correct tactical maneuver to spend the most steel to deal the most damage for on the American ships was to use these as the 1940s version. You use pilots as the 1940s version of like guided homing missiles. It's much easier to teach someone to like fly into a plane than it is to like dogfight with with a zero, right? And kind of going from, so on the one hand, like it quote unquote makes sense. On the other hand, like sending people to, and also, you have this sense that on a lot of these missions, which aren't literally suicide missions, you have Americans who are at some level doing the same thing. And you have sort of like flights that, groups that go off carriers where, 12 planes go out and like 1 or 2 make it back. But there is something that is particularly like resonant and horrific. And, my guess is 500 years from now, if people are talking about anything when it comes to sort of World War, the Pacific War, the kamikaze is going to kamikaze flights, I think, is going to, be that thing that makes it into the 3 lines that people still remember. So, yeah, I mean, how did you approach that? What were the sides that you wanted to, what are the different aspects of the story that you really wanted to have hit as you were describing the different levels at which the kamikaze story played out?
Yeah, well, you accurately introduced the subject. The Japanese had trained, what may have been pounds for pound pilots and pilot the best carrier pilot cadre of carrier pilots in the world at the beginning of the war. I mean, they really were superb, and they had been, there had been this national selection process, extremely difficult, tougher than getting into Stanford today, getting accepted to naval pilot training in 1939, 1940. and then going through this extremely rigorous pilot training process that really built these superb pilots, but they never really thought seriously in Japan about the problem of expanding that training pipeline to produce many, many more pilots in order to fight a war on the scale of the Pacific War. And so when their first team of pilots were killed off in 1942, 43, there were a few left by 1944. They did not have this next generation of pilots to come in and carry on the fight. And so you were absolutely right, Jordan, when you say that the decision to deploy kamikazes on a mass scale was tactically correct in a sense. That if you have pilots who you cannot afford to train, you don't have the time, the fuel, the resources to train pilots to effectively attack ships using a conventional dive bombing attack, using a conventional aerial torpedo attack, the kinds of attacks that the Japanese had used so effectively in the early part of the war. Then maybe what you do is you train the pilot to fly a ship, fly a plane with a bomb attached to it into a ship like a guided missile. Maybe that's simply the best tactical use of the resource that you have. And I do believe that is ultimately what persuaded the Japanese to go ahead and to deploy kamikazes on basically their entire air war was a kamikaze war in the last year of the war. And then you have, on top of that, you have this question of the morality of, sending 20, 21, 22-year-old men to their certain deaths in this situation. And I think the part of the story that has been neglected and forgotten in the West is that this was immensely controversial even in Japan. And the kamikazes came to be revered. But at the outset, even within the military, within the Navy was mainly the kamikaze service that launched the kamikazes. There was immense opposition to this within the ranks of the Japanese Navy, and it took time for this to be accepted that this was the way they were going to fight this war. And so trying to understand, again, what it was like to be a kamikaze pilot, to draw upon these letters and principally letters and diaries that have been published, many of them in English. But then also really what it did to the crew of a ship to know that they were under this kind of attack, and the sort of unique sense of horror that they felt operating off of Okinawa in particular, at really the height of the kamikaze campaign, where you had ships, 34 ships were sunk, many, many more badly damaged, with Navy casualties running well into the thousands. I think more Navy personnel were killed than Army or Marine at the Battle of Okinawa, as bad as the ground fighting was. And so that kind of unique sort of sense of horror and loathing that they felt as these planes came in, making a beeline, flying these suicide runs, and often doing terrible damage.
Well, so I was struck by the other facet that kind of built up for me the understanding of how the kamikazes emerged. There's the logic of how do you most efficiently use your limited number of airplanes and pilots to sink ships. But it also seemed like the Japanese army and all of its island defenses was itself pursuing a somewhat kamikaze-esque strategy. In all these island campaigns, you'd have 90% plus of the Japanese garrisons killed. And they would start the battle knowing they would lose, but trying to exact as much punishment as they could, which at a strategic level, again, is sort of rational, but tactically a brutal way to fight a campaign. And so I found myself wondering, did the Japanese army have its own version of kamikaze mentality? And then actually, was the entire war effort on Japan's side essentially suicidal after 1942, when it was obvious to everyone that the production differences were large enough that Japan would definitely lose? Is there something to that analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could say the kamikazes are a way, kind of a metaphor for the entire project of Imperial Japan, and in particular after Midway and Guadalcanal, and when we reached the second half of the Pacific War, when it really was clear that Japan was going to lose the war, whatever that meant. Losing could be many different versions of losing the war. But histories have really traced the way within the Japanese army. You had this cultural change that occurred after the Russo-Japanese War, and then especially after the First World War, in which the Japanese army sort of leadership convinced itself, we have got to do something about this problem of our soldiers surrendering. That's not acceptable. And they actually altered the military manuals and the standing orders to say, you shall not surrender in any circumstance. There will never be any surrender in the Japanese army. And that was a very fateful decision, because once you've put your soldiers in that situation, in which they know they're not going to survive, that they're going to fight to the last man, I think that alters the psychology on the battlefield and leads inevitably to a much, much more brutal environment. And so on one island after another, as you say, I think it started most famously on the Aleutian island of Attu in the spring of 1943. You had entire Japanese garrisons fighting and dying to the last man. And then this being celebrated in Japan by a press that was being very, very closely guided and censored by the regime there, building in Japan this kind of sense that, this is an extraordinary act of bravery, of commitment, of fanaticism that the Allies, the Americans, would never be able to match, and that this was really going to be the kind of secret weapon for the Japanese, showing that they were willing to make much greater sacrifices than their enemies were. And then as the war went on, as our forces drew closer to Japan, the story really changed to, this is how we're going to protect the homeland. We're going to show the Americans that the cost of invading our homeland, of trying to occupy our homeland, is so great that you're not going to want to pay it. And so really it became a question of, could they force the Americans to the negotiating table to resolve this conflict in a way in which Japan might have to acknowledge its defeat. That would mean essentially giving up some portion of its overseas empire, but to preserve its emperor system and to keep American and Allied troops out of Japanese territory. That became the driving kind of obsession of the Japanese leadership in the last year to year and a half of the war. And so these fanatical demonstrations, fighting to the last man on one island after another, the kamikazes, that all became sort of a kind of theater, a way of showing the Americans, this is what you're dealing with. We're different from other people. We're willing to, the whole country will die to the last man, women, and child if necessary. And so wouldn't it be better than to sit down and negotiate some sort of a solution to this war, which leaves us with some vestige of the imperial project intact?
Yeah, it's interesting. So much comes out of that. I mean, there's of course the irony that by the time the Americans land, MacArthur has this line where he's like, actually, like when we got here, we were just taking this big bet that they wouldn't want to fight anymore, because if somehow someone snapped a finger and the sort of rebellion turned on, we would be pretty shit out of luck. Like we didn't have enough troops to do this. But the fact was, like, once the war was done, the war was done. And, the only people still fighting were like 5 guys or, in the hills of the Philippines who just like didn't get the message or something. Another sort of really interesting contrast is like why Nazi Germany took it to the end and why the Japanese took it to the end. I mean, with Nazi Germany, it was basically one guy. And all the generals, definitely by like late late 1944. I mean, you had a whole plot. Everyone saw the writing on the wall, and there was a wide consensus, enough to like have a whole conspiracy. And you had these like back channel feelers to the English and whatnot. But because of, as you described, the kind of lack of because there wasn't as much as a focal point, and you had more of this consensus driven thing. Even though you had dissenting voices, they weren't able to mobilize even as much as like the Operation Valkyrie folks were. And you have this sort of thesis in Japan of, oh, if we just show them how freaking crazy we are, then they'll come to the negotiating table. But like they never even really tried to do the negotiating in the first place, aside from this sort of like fake conversation with the Soviets, which like anyone really could have seen wasn't actually going anywhere. So yeah, let's talk maybe some elite Japanese politics as well, starting in the second half of the war. As like, even though everyone was doing all these like suicide, even though everyone knew they were on this national suicide mission by 1943, I don't know, we still have like a few million more people have to die before we get to the inevitable conclusion.
Right. Yeah, man. I think it's to really understand what was happening in Japan, in the ruling circle in Japan in the last year of the war. I think it's necessary to go back to the beginning of the 1930s and to understand how Japan kind of descended into this militarist tyranny. And the story there is essentially one of extraordinary turmoil, chaos, revolutionary energy, assassinations, uprisings, really a almost complete breakdown of discipline within the ranks of the Army in particular, but also the Navy, in which again and again you have hot-headed extremist officers, factions of younger mid-ranking officers, essentially threatening the Japanese leadership at gunpoint, and forcing this much more right-wing, fanatical, imperialist, aggressive kind of foreign policy and domestic policy, in which increasingly the generals and the admirals were running every aspect of not just military and foreign affairs, but domestic affairs as well. You had the Army essentially take over the Japanese education system in the 1930s. And what had happened with, beginning with what they called the China incident, the beginning of the China War, Sino-Japanese War in 1937, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor and the war with Great Britain and the U.S. beginning in 1941, was that because you had these large foreign wars, it tended to, if not heal, at least to stabilize this domestic turmoil within Japan. And so the leadership in Japan sort of saw the war as a way to kind of maintain this sort of fragile peace, this fragile stability within a society that was in many ways very revolutionary. And so as you approach the end of the Pacific War, the problem isn't just, do we surrender or not? The problem is, whatever we do as a country, if we surrender, if we initiate negotiations, if we try to use diplomacy to get out of this war, whatever we do, there's the threat of a sort of a resumption of these assassinations, essentially a kind of a civil war. You could have a civil war between different elements within the Army. You could have fighting between the Army and the Navy. This was seen in Japan as being a very real, a real danger. And so and then to complicate the picture even more, you have in the U.S., we have a window, imperfect, but we have a window into what's happening within the ruling circle in Japan, because we're reading their diplomatic mail. We have broken their codes. Communications between the foreign ministry in Tokyo and embassies, Japanese embassies throughout the world, essentially we're intercepting those messages, we're decoding them, and we're reading them. And so we are aware that the Japanese, by the spring of 1945 essentially see their last hope as bringing Stalin and the Soviet government in to mediate the kind of between the U.S. and Great Britain. The Japanese had a historical precedent for this. The end of the Russo-Japanese War, it ended with a negotiated peace between Russia and Japan, which had been mediated by our government. Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Prize for peace for that mediation. And so they're trying to replicate what they had seen as the kind of acceptable end to the Russo-Japanese War, a negotiated settlement which allowed them to maintain and build upon their empire. So here they would like to try to negotiate a truce. They're deeply divided within the ruling circle over what such a negotiated arrangement might look like. But then the point I think often forgotten in the West is it's not just a division, it's the a fear of a sort of a descent into complete chaos and civil war, which would make it impossible for the Japanese government to do anything in an organized way. And we, I think our leaders understood enough of that dynamic that we, saw the kind of necessity of strengthening the peace faction within the ruling circle and neutralizing the army in particular that wanted to fight on, and the atomic bomb became a means to that end.
But I thought the violence of, which you only dip into, but the violence of Japanese politics in the 20s and 30s ends up seeming like a really important driver of the violence of Japan's war effort and even the suicide dynamics that we just discussed. Like you get some of that in Japanese army politics in the 20s and 30s as well. And so it's almost as if like the Japanese army took over the entire country, not just in terms of running the schools, but in terms of running the culture to a substantial degree.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with that, Chris.
Well, maybe let's zoom back a little bit and talk about the Pearl Harbor decision. Yamamoto famously was like doing his best to talk everyone out of this. But then at a certain point, he's like, all right, you guys are dumb enough to do it. Might as well do the dumb thing the smart way. And I think the thing that strikes me about the sort of, like the fundamental tension of like this narrative history, and it's something you touch on in your conclusion as well, is like, once you get sort of Pearl Harbor and the American political reaction to it, it kind of like that is your turning point, is like America deciding to fight this war in the first place. And regardless of, if Midway had gone this or that way, if the Marines had gotten, kicked off of Guadalcanal, it's like you have such an enormous material material imbalance between the Americans and the Japanese. And if because of Japanese politics, you're taking off the table Japan ever wanting to like, cash in their chips and negotiate in the first place, then it seems like all of this is pretty inevitable and baked in from the beginning. So, how do you think about that sort of inevitability question? And, if it's all inevitable, aside from sort of the human drama of the smells and the visuals, like, why are we, what is the point of spending so much time and energy to study this stuff in the first place?
Yeah. Well, it's an issue that will never be resolved. It's the kind of the question of, do we want to take a determinist approach to understanding the Second World War? I probably lean a little bit more toward the determinist way of thinking about it. Winston Churchill, in his post-war memoir of the Second World War, had a famous passage in which he said, as soon as he had heard the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he said, so we had won after all, meaning that this entire conflict, including the conflict with Nazi Germany, was now going to be settled. It was just, I think the term he used was, it was just a question of the proper application of military power. Now, that was written many years later. I think it was sort of deliberately provocative in that kind of mischievous Churchillian way. But I do think that there is absolute truth in the reality that before the attack on Pearl Harbor, you had in this country a deeply, deeply divided political situation in Washington, in which the isolationist movement was perhaps even gaining strength in the fall of 1941. This is a movement that had strength in both the Democratic and Republican parties. It had strength in every region. It was a formidable political kind of a force in our politics, a sense of real moral fervor around this idea that we were not once again going to be dragged into a global war. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that movement collapsed overnight. And when I say overnight, I mean literally overnight. FDR asked for a declaration of war against Japan the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It passed both houses of Congress. I think there was one dissenting vote in the House. There was a unanimous vote in the Senate. And so it does not go too far to say that this one decision the Japanese made to attack, launch this surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, had essentially completely altered the domestic politics around at least going to war against Japan. 3 days later, Hitler made the curious decision to declare war on the United States when we hadn't declared war on him. So then it was a global war, and now you have the largest economy in the world, the economy with by far the greatest latent military power. And not only were we a combatant, but we had the kind of broad consensus, public political consensus that we needed to quickly mobilize our economy for war, which we did. And so I agree. I think that was the turning point. It was the attack on Pearl Harbor and the reaction, necessarily the reaction, the political reaction within the U.S. That I think really made it inevitable that not just Japan, but Nazi Germany would be finished within 3 to 4 years. And then the one other major contingency I would say is the fact that the Soviets were able to stop the German attack on the Eastern Front and stabilize that war and survive long enough so that Allied supplies could get in, allow them to turn the tide. If there had been some sort of a surrender on the Eastern Front, that's another major contingency that could have taken the entire war, including the Pacific War, in a different direction.
I want to start talking about the generals and admirals.
Yeah, let's do it.
I think we start with Nimitz. That's kind of where you started. You have this like wonderful opening of him taking this kind of secret train ride across America and like digesting what he's about to do, and he's like trying to relax and play poker with his bud, but at the same time he kind of understands the gravity of the situation. I think he Chris, how did you had a good characterization. You asked this question.
Well, I was struck by the extent to which Nimitz has now been, to a large degree, forgotten in American public discourse, but to which he came out in your telling is probably the most important strategic thinker and very skilled in execution of the war in the Pacific. And the contrast between him and MacArthur was, to me, striking, given that MacArthur is the one that's remembered. So maybe start with Nimitz, and I'd love to dig into MacArthur after that.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I always find very striking when you look at the admirals and in the officers of leadership in the Navy during the Second World War is that you have a group of men who really have lived parallel lives since the age of 17, 18 years old when they entered the Naval Academy. And so they have been shaped by a culture, by a context, a profession, and that had a very, very pretty rigorous ideas about what leadership should look like. And yet, when they reach the pinnacle of their careers, you realize these guys are very, very different. They have different personalities. They have different styles. They have different ways of making decisions. They present themselves differently. And so the kind of the full range of different personalities really comes through in the way that the leadership class, I think this is true in the Army as well, approached the this business of winning this vast, unprecedented war that they had really been preparing for their entire lives. Nimitz was the handpicked choice of FDR. FDR, we talked about it earlier. He was, not just very confident in the role of commander in chief, but in particular, he had this kind of parochial kind of feeling about the Navy because he had served in the sub cabinet position earlier in his career, I think, and because he had been president for such a long time and had really kind of personally pushed through and run this naval mobilization that had occurred, this vast expansion in our Navy, the Two Navy Ocean Act, which had occurred before the beginning of the Second World War. So FDR was very involved in personnel decisions at the highest level of the Navy. He selected admirals. And so Nimitz was his choice. He had first offered the job of Pacific Fleet Chief to Nimitz 9 months before Pearl Harbor. And Nimitz had demurred. He'd said he thought he was too junior an admiral to take the position, and that it would for him to accept that command would arouse a lot of opposition and resentment within among some of the other admirals, and that therefore he thought it was a bad idea. So they passed on it, and they gave it to husband Kimmel instead. So when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, when all of our battleships were knocked out of action in the first 15 minutes of the war, when husband Kimmel was made essentially to perform the role of the scapegoat for that, Nimitz was first to understand that really this could have been him. It would have been him, most likely, if he had been. And so we would have remembered Nimitz very differently. And that's a kind of a snapshot of how historical contingency can cast such a long shadow down the decades. Nimitz could have been in the position of husband Kimmel, a person that we remember solely because he suffered this terrible defeat. But Nimitz's great strength, I think, was that he had a gentle touch. His leadership style was really based on personal warmth to a great degree. And so really what he was able to do was, after the trauma of Pearl Harbor, he was able to show up in Hawaii. He's now the theater commander. He's got a fifth of the Earth's surface within his theater command. It's really enormous command of not just the Navy, but the Army, the Marines, the Air Force in his theater. And he's able to essentially kind of preside over this fractious group of people who are arguing over how to fight this war, and to get them to work together and to forge a team out of what was in many ways somewhat of a dysfunctional way of managing inter-service operations in the 1940s. And so, yes, I think he was the right man for that job. You said that you thought he was forgotten today. Well, that's true. I think probably even more true of Ernest King, who was his direct superior, chief of naval operations. This is a guy who I think is really largely forgotten by, even many people who are interested in military history and the history of the Second World War have only the vaguest idea of who Ernest King was. But if you look at the major decisions that were made on the way that we would fight and win the Pacific War, the way that we would pick up the pieces after Pearl Harbor and put together an offensive, which eventually, less than 4 years later, would force the surrender of Japan. I think it was Ernest King, really more than anybody else, who had a blueprint in mind for how we would do that, and who was in a position to impose that blueprint on the rest of the Navy and all of the military services.
I want to talk a little bit about the contrast of styles of thinking that the Admiralty ended up having to do, where on the one hand, you present these scenes of these big kind of conference room debates where MacArthur says we should go left and Nimitz says we should go right. And they're, making lots of different styles of arguments. Some are doing it from a sort of like logistics perspective, others from a morale perspective. But it's, this model of like slow thinking and deliberation, right? And then, okay, they decide this thing, and then you have all of these, plans and logistics, and you get the boats in place. And then, because of the sort of nature of carrier warfare in this moment in history, there is this incredible, like, fast twitch decision-making stuff where you have this imperfect information because your scout plane may have seen something, and then you kind of have to do this incredible. I think one of the admirals was like, these carriers, they're boxers with glass chins, but they have enormous left hooks, and all we're doing is just deciding when to swing and hoping for the best. And it becomes very, at both levels of thinking, it's very human, right? Where with the slow thinking, you have all these personal histories that are intertwined, and everyone is thinking about their reputation and trying to save their people and husband resources and what have you. And then, with the admiral decisions, we have these like, some people just haven't slept in 48 hours and they got to make these calls. And then there's this other guy who's like, all right, I'm going to delegate everything because I know I need to be sharp and fresh for the big thinking, when I have to make these like enormous strategic calls. So
you're talking about.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that these flag officers have to do, which is very different, I think, of the sort of modes that they have to work. And you explored that really beautifully. Curious, kind of reflecting on that, and sort of what it said about the nature of warfare and the nature of these people at the moment in time.
Yeah, no, it's really true, because the planning and anticipation of how these battles would go was really important. Getting those decisions right, moving your forces into position at the right time. I think at Midway, most famously, Nimitz had essentially a picture of what the Japanese plan was, thanks to this extraordinary intelligence achievement of breaking the Japanese codes. And he was able to move what forces he had at that point, which was 3 aircraft carriers, into position to do battle. But after that, everything that happened was essentially contingency. It was chaos. There was a lot of chance involved. That battle could have gone the other way. And you had Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, the 2 American admirals, essentially kind of making decisions with imperfect information, feeling their way through the fog of war, and in the end, winning that battle narrowly, with a pretty significant contribution of blind luck, good luck. And so, and you could see this again and again in naval battles in the Pacific. You have, if the right plan is put in place, you're really improving the odds for your side. And yet there's still these kinds of, as you say, these sort of fast twitch decisions that have to be made, these opportunistic decisions, probabilistic decisions when you don't have all of the information you need. And I think I agree with you. Those are 2 entirely different ways of thinking about military command. They may kind of play to the strengths or weaknesses of different personality types. But one of the things that I think Nimitz did particularly well, and he did this again and again, was to develop a plan to make sure that his sub-commanders, his ocean-going commanders, understood that plan, to make sure that they realized they were to execute this plan in the same way that he would if he were there commanding a task force at sea. But then once they left, Nimitz is in his headquarters, back in Hawaii in Pearl Harbor. You've got Halsey or Nimitz or Spruance or whoever the task force commander is on the scene, And Nimitz, although he was often tempted, he never actually got on the radio and intervened and started forcing decisions. He delegated those tactical decisions, even in a major battle, without interfering, trusting to the judgment of his subordinates. And most of the time, that judgment was vindicated.
In Nimitz, to me, came off as sort of the opposite of a gung ho military leader that one might kind of stereotype. Like you used the words leading by his personal warmth, being gentle. And that really came through in the narrative in a way. He sort of felt like a grandfather figure to me,
Yep.
but was super effective. And the one time he came down hard on a subordinate with the Where is Task Force 37 telegram, it was like the softest criticism you could envision. I want to pick up on the fog of war. There's fog of war is a metaphor and fog of war is reality, with the weather playing such a critical role in basically every single battle. And I felt like
that's a good point. I've never thought of that. I might have to steal that. The fog of war is a very frequent metaphor in naval warfare. It often becomes actually a literal problem.
Well, it was, you've kind of felt the clouds rolling in and every single battle rolling in and out. And then the typhoon you have off of Lady Gulf, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, this extraordinary, you're fighting a battle, and then you're also like dealing with these kind of ancient problems of seamanship at the same time. And so talk about contingency. Every single battle has this sort of uncertainty. What will the weather be like in 3 days? And your ability to find or be found was like hugely impacted in the state, when radar was not very good, by what were the cloud patterns like. That was a great example of kind of the contingency at every moment.
Yeah, and the weather really is this kind of universal thing. I think I quoted I believe in the third book, I quoted Joseph Conrad, who was a sea captain before he was a novelist, and he'd been through a typhoon in exactly the same waters, just off Formosa or Taiwan. And it just occurred to me as I was reading that description by Conrad, this is essentially the same storm. I mean, it's 5 decades, 6 decades later, but that's Typhoon Alley. You have those storms going through every year, and essentially, it's you could pick a description if one existed from 2,000 years ago, and you'd be describing the same storm. And then our Navy and the navies of other countries in the Pacific today have got to deal with those same kinds of weather patterns, right? So there's something really kind of universal across time to that X factor of weather, and I think that particularly comes to bear on naval warfare.
Yeah, I mean, there's something sort of about the suspense of not knowing where the enemy ships are, which is like kind of foreign to a modern mind today. I mean, you think like the 1940s are not that far away, right? But like there are no satellites. Radar is like just kind of starting. And so there are so many more uncertainties that you have, that these folks are facing than,
You're relying on your planes to be your eyes too, right? So the patrol flights become absolutely essential. And it's very easy for a plane to, fly directly over a ship and not see it in overcast weather. And we saw that happen again and again, where you've got patrol planes moving out from these task forces. They're supposed to be the first trigger to tell you if there's an enemy there. And as you say, really, there's a much more of a sense of, particularly in the earlier part of the war, I think, of the fleets kind of being blind, and having to make decisions with, really not being certain of where the enemy is, if the enemy is there, how far, what direction, and that kind of uncertainty, the kind of tension, and inherently the drama of that kind of conflict.
Should we talk about submarine warfare?
Let me do one more, Admiral, and then we'll talk about the sub. So, we have the sort of genteel, like modern manager and Nimitz. We also have Bull Halsey. Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be only spoken in hell. Kill Japs, kill more Japs. I mean, the guy is like living up, the caricature of him starts, and then he's like, all right, I guess I'm doing this. And there are numerous points where sort of the mythos of him is such that he's kept in positions longer than he would be otherwise, because I think his FDR is like, oh, like, we're already gonna win, and it would be a weird sign to like get this guy out of command. So yeah, I mean, like the sort of his ethos is much more of the sort of like the duality of this, which Chris was alluding to earlier, about just how kind of a brutal a mindset you needed to be in to start these operations where you knew tens of thousands of people would die in over the course of a fortnight.
Could I add one follow-up there, though?
Sure.
I was struck by, on the one hand, some of the key, really costly errors that you described were made by him.
Yes.
But also, it seems like you were suggesting pretty strong evidence that the people under his command really loved him.
Yes.
So
I think that's
where's
true.
the balance sheet there?
Yeah, there's some caveats to that. Halsey became very controversial within the ranks of the Navy in the last year of the war, and he had some pretty severe critics, including some of the rear admirals who were the task group commanders of the Third Fleet. So these were really the next generation of leaders, the guys who would be promoted into the senior positions just in the immediate post-war period. And the piece that I think is, I mean, I agree with everything that you both have said about Bill Halsey, but the piece that I think is often missing, and it's true really when you consider MacArthur's career as well, is just how important their public images became. They became important in the sense that, the United States as a democracy that has elections during wartime, which makes us a little different from other democracies. The political influence of a military leader can become very, very great in wartime. And you had a new media environment, right? I mean, film, television, not television yet, sorry, but film and radio. The ability to run the same photographs, on newspapers all across the country. I mean, a lot of these technologies that we take for granted, that really had changed the political environment. So when you had leaders like MacArthur and Halsey, I'll put them into the same category here, who were very, very good at speaking directly to the American people and to the rank and file of the military services through the media, and became media darlings, became people that the reporters always wanted to talk to. They wanted that quotable line. They wanted the photograph. It sold newspapers. The American people started to look at the war, to understand it by listening to these very colorful, charismatic figures. That becomes a real kind of a political consideration. 1944 is an election year in the United States, and MacArthur is quite seriously considering running against FDR and is sort of implicitly threatening to do that. At the same time that FDR is faced with this decision of, are we returning to the Philippines or not? Halsey's making significant mistakes, most significantly in October 1944, where he makes a mistake that could have led to a disaster and only didn't really because of blind luck. It was well understood within the Navy that he had made this sort of inexplicable error. And there's a feeling that he should be held to account, that he should not be running the Third Fleet anymore, that he should be relieved of command, maybe put into a different position. But his political popularity, his profile with the American people as being really at that point kind of the face of the U.S. Navy, that becomes a factor really in the decision to keep him in place. And so the interplay of politics, publicity, media, and the way that all of that influences that, major decisions that are being made at the height of the most bloodiest war in history, that to me is a sort of a fascinating part of this story that I think hasn't received as much attention in the historical literature.
And I love the description of MacArthur's press team, the most well-oiled press team outside of Washington.
Right.
I learned a lot from that.
Yeah. But I was just going to say, I think MacArthur's emergence as really the kind of the principal hero. I don't think go too far to say that to the American people during the Second World War, MacArthur really was, virtually on a par with FDR, seen as sort of a national figure, a leader, sort of a symbol, uh, and and all of that happened extraordinarily fast. And this is a lesson really about the way media can work, and media can work in wartime. Is that in the sort of immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, you had a sense, and I'm talking this 4 or 5 days after Pearl Harbor, you had this kind of sense of rage among the American people, anger at the Japanese, but also against our own military leadership, our Navy leadership in particular. How could you let this happen? How could we be blindsided like this in the heart of our fleet base? A sense of shame, a sense that we'd been humiliated. It was inexplicable. And then almost immediately, you have this other storyline in the Philippines where the Japanese are invading, and you have this beleaguered army, outmanned, outnumbered. They're too far away. We can't support them, in part because of what had happened at Pearl Harbor. Do they have a future? They're sort of fighting for their survival. And MacArthur is the guy who then is able to step in with a very, very aggressive and effective media strategy to shape the way that story is being told and kind of give the American people another storyline, a heroic storyline. And so in a people who have been kind of conditioned by movies to sort of understand complex events, through this kind of heroic kind of narrative, MacArthur is stepping right into that and very, very effectively using media, photographs, the daily tables that he's writing describing the war to sort of establish himself as this singular figure. And that then continues right through the Korean War when he's fired by Harry Truman and very, almost causes a kind of a revolt within the Democratic Party when Truman does that. So for 10 years, MacArthur was able to sort of ride that successful media strategy. And that's interesting to me just because I think in an authoritarian and a fascist or authoritarian model of government, you don't have that. You don't have the ability of individual military leaders to sort of challenge implicitly the political leadership with an appeal directly to the people through the media and press.
There were a few other sort of media beats which I thought were fascinating. One was this debate, I believe in like October of 1944, just a few weeks before the presidential election, of whether or not to let the public know that a carrier had sunk. The Japanese had sunk a carrier, and on the one hand, you have an admiral saying, no, please don't tell the Japanese that this carrier had sunk. And the other saying, it's kind of like Comey, like this would be an enormous scandal if we don't tell the American people, the facts a few weeks before. But I think my favorite arc was the one that King had with, I believe it was King, with the press corps in Washington, where for the first year, for the first few years, or why don't you tell the story? I thought it was great.
Yeah, well, so King is like many admirals, has really been the kind of the culture of the Navy really inculcated this kind of anti-media, anti-public relations kind of a philosophy that it's dangerous to play with the media. They can divulge your secrets. You should lie low. We should be the silent service with the Navy. We can tell the American people what happened after we win the war. There was a joke going around that King's philosophy of disclosure in media was, we'll tell the media and the American people absolutely nothing about what's happening until the day the Japanese surrender, and then we'll put out a 2-word press release, we won. And, for 1,000 reasons, that became a sort of a problematic, unsustainable approach to take. The army was, particularly MacArthur, was kind of stepping into this void, was shaping the way the American people understood the Pacific War to be unfolding. There was an understanding among all of the military services that as soon as the war was won, there was going to be a complete reorganization of the service of what we have today. We have a Secretary of Defense, we have a Pentagon, we have Joint Chiefs, we have a way of kind of managing the different military services, forcing them to work together. None of that existed in the 1940s. And it was understood, because FDR had essentially decreed it, we will reform, reorganize the military, but let's get the war done first. So in a sense, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, they have their own agendas, and they're kind of positioning themselves for this immense reform, this kind of bureaucratic refashioning of the Navy that they know is coming. And so for all of these reasons, King is eventually convinced, well, I can't just ignore the media. This is a democracy. I've got to have some sort of strategy. And it was his own lawyer, who was a former reporter, who proposed, oh, why don't you start off the record briefings? Just get a bunch of reporters together in Washington. We'll meet somewhere, not at your office, off site. You do it at my house. And we'll get these guys together. We'll have ground rules. It will be, they didn't have the term then, but what would be today be called a deep background briefing, meaning you're not going to use any of what's disclosed. None of it's going to be written up into any article. You're not going to source anything. You're not going to quote King, but it's going to help you understand what's happening, so that will contribute to the way that you write the stories that you can write. And King thought this was crazy. Why would you trust a bunch of reporters under these kinds of ground rules? He was persuaded if you get reputable reporters, they will adhere to these ground rules. And, he did this. And after the first 3 hours of sitting with 20 reporters in Alexandria, Virginia, at his lawyer's house, he realized this is exactly what I need to be doing, because I'm getting these guys on side. I can then begin manipulating press coverage a little bit. And even more than that, this is an opportunity for me to sort of explain at a high level the strategic issues that we're dealing with to a bunch of guys who really are outsiders, but who are highly intelligent. King realized this is actually helping me to shape my own thinking in a beneficial way. And so for the rest of the war, he continued doing these deep background briefings. And I think that was, it was an interesting arc. It was it helps us understand a little bit about who Ernest King was. But it also, I think, really sort of illuminates these issues that really are unique to running a war in a democracy, very, very different from the kinds of challenges that Stalin, Hitler, or virtually anybody else would have faced.
Subs, yeah, sure. So I was struck by the centrality of submarine warfare in the struggles that Japan faced. And there's been some books on this in the past, from several decades ago, but relative to the Battle of the Atlantic, which takes absolutely central stage in histories of the war in Europe, the fact that the Japanese faced and lost the Battle of the Pacific in terms of shipping seems really central. And I was struck by the way that you really brought the submarine warfare to life, the USS Wahoo being a great case study. And then upstream of that was the question of torpedoes, which Jordan mentioned at the outset, of how do you get torpedoes that actually work, which ends up being this extraordinary kind of technical, bureaucratic struggle. So give us a bit of a glimpse into kind of the trajectory of submarine warfare and its impact on the scope of the war.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess one way to start is just to point out that what you have in the submarine war, in the war of commerce, any war of commerce, the Atlantic, Battle of the Atlantic could be another example of that. What you have is essentially a kind of a cumulative way of fighting the war. What you want to do is you want to sink a certain amount of shipping. You want to sink oil tankers. You want to little by little diminish the ability of your enemy to actually carry on the war. You're attacking the economic underpinnings, the logistics underpinnings of the war. And so it's a very different kind of a campaign. The the war that the rest of the Navy is fighting, that the Army is fighting, the Marines are fighting, you can diagram it on a map, right? It's we're going to take this group of islands, and then we're going to move, and we're going to take this group of islands, and we're going to fight a naval battle here, and you could diagram the naval battle, and then you could show how that opens the way for us to make this next westward thrust, always moving closer to the Japanese islands. When you have the war that the submarines carried on, essentially it's one, you're kind of pecking. So it's been pecked. You're being pecked to death. Essentially, it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's sink one oil tanker at a time. And there's this cumulative effect in which the Japanese war economy is starting to kind of sputter and run out of gas, and their ability to carry on the war becomes critical in the last year of the war. So, trying to tell these stories side by side, you have to realize these are almost entirely separate campaigns. I mean, there's very little direct coordination going on between these two campaigns, and they're both important, and they're working together. So, that really wasn't the way the submarines had been envisioned before the war. It's an interesting part of the story is how the submarine commanders themselves came to realize, we're not using this resource in the optimal way if we're using them to support fleet movements or to go out and be eyes and ears for the fleet. This was a way fleet submarines, they called them, these diesel submarines, they had been built with a very different role in mind. They were going to sort of operate at the edges of these task forces as they went out. They weren't going to fight the kind of long solitary cruises where they're going primarily trying to sink oil tankers and freighters. And it took until about 1943 for the Navy to realize we're not using this resource in the way we should. And really what we should do is largely disconnect the Navy submarines from what the rest of the fleet is doing. And just send them out there to try to sink oil tankers in particular. Let's try to starve Japan of oil and other resources. And once they did that, once they fixed the torpedo problem, it really became clear, I think, to the Japanese that they simply really had nowhere to go. Japan is a country poor in natural resources. It always has been. It has negligible oil production. It has always relied on importing oil. And their decision to attack us at Pearl Harbor was largely about oil. They had an oil stockpile. They needed more. We had cut off the supply of Texas oil. And so they needed to go down to Borneo and Sumatra, take the Dutch and British oil fields there, and to replace that supply. And then they had the problem of transporting that oil from what is today Indonesia to Japan, 3,000 miles, an artery that, if we could sever, essentially would cause the entire Japanese imperial project to bleed out. And that is, in fact, what happened in 1944 and 1945. And so it really was, from the kind of point of view of telling the story, you can do it with statistics. There were this many fleet boats that were going out. They were, going on patrols of this average length for this many weeks. They were sinking this many ships on average. And those statistics will tell a story. But in order to really kind of bring the reader into what's happening, you've got to use this device of just taking an individual boat and saying, let's imagine what it's like now to actually go on this cruise on the Wahoo, and to see it from the perspective of those who are in the crew. And then using the example of that one very, very successful submarine and her career to illuminate the larger story.
Yeah, the Wahoo arc. I mean, there are aspects of a video game. It felt like we're like, oh, we just got to line up the shot, and you're doing these like crazy trick shots down the chute, and then you got to dive, and everything's exploding around you. But it does sort of tie back to these larger strategic questions, and I think the sort of like bottoms up tactical innovations, both kind of understanding that the torpedoes were wrong, and then also being like, no, like we should not be going around with the carriers. We should be off in the, between Japan and China to sort of shoot down different oil tankers was fascinating. And I think sort of one of the big themes is that there is sort of technological innovation and change that happens from 41 to 45, but almost more than that, there are these failures of imagination, which obviously kind of starting with Pearl Harbor, but then the sort of long evolution of understanding that it's carriers and not battleships, and then understanding that it's submarines and sort of not taking the territory, and then understanding that like, oh, actually we can just skip these islands and don't have to kill everyone. And on the Japanese side, we've talked about the kamikazes, we haven't talked too much about the infantry side, but kind of going from these bonsai charges to like honeycombing into these ancient mountains.
Right.
Like the fact that there is so much kind of room to get better, even at a time of, I would say, like moderate technological change, not like super rapid technological change, really came through over the course of your narrative.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you're right. We haven't talked about how the Japanese infantry tactics, army tactics evolved, but that was a really important change that happened. Again, it was really the last year of the war, when you had it was really individual army commanders realizing, we have been using our army in entirely the wrong way. And if our goal now is to exact the greatest possible price as the Americans come across the Pacific island by island, shrinking the ring around our home islands, then the way we do that is by digging into the ground, making them come to us, and put 5 or 6 of their guys for every one they get of ours, and that became the focus of the army. They abandoned the bonsai charge entirely and began digging in at places you saw it. Really, I think probably most effectively you saw it at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of abstracting away from that. Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Just like the fact that you can come up with such better operational, you can become 50% more effective by just like using the same tools you have available in a different way isn't something that you would expect, given how many kind of experiments are being run, right? But even in Okinawa, right? Like they still talk themselves into some stupid attack because of the sort of like instinctive doctrines that they've been drilled in for the past few decades.
Yeah, a sense of honor too, right? So in Okinawa, you have a defensive line of defensive fortifications that crosses the island. Okinawa is a long, narrow island, about 60 miles long. It's, maybe 9-10 miles wide. And at the narrowest point, they picked rocky, mountainous ground in the southern part of the island, and they built essentially a string of extraordinarily ambitious tunnels and caves across the island. And if they're going to hold out, if they're going to buy time, if they're going to inflict casualties on the Americans, then really what they should do is stay in that high ground to use the advantages of terrain and of those prepared defensive positions. But then once the Americans are ashore and they've taken the major airfields, they're immediately going to start preparing Okinawa as a stepping stone to Kyushu. They're going to use those airfields to start bombing the Japanese homeland. And so now you have immense pressure within the Japanese army to we've got to do something about this. We can't just stay here. We've got to contest what the Americans are doing with the rest of the island. So again and again, they sally out from these defensive fortifications. They get mowed down. They suffer terrible casualties and eventually realize we have to go back to this blueprint of just trying to survive, stay alive for as long as we can, take as many of the Americans with us as possible. So you're right. It's an evolving sort of understanding of what the ideal tactics are in these battles. But then it's also this interplay, and I think military historians often are not as good at doing this subtle interplay of politics, policy, and then in the way that military decisions, strategic decisions are made, partly in response to those influences. And that you see that in Japan, you see that in the U.S., see it in Great Britain for sure. And that's a part of the picture that I think really it's important to illuminate. It becomes relevant too when we talk about the way that different kinds of countries and regimes will wage war even when they have similar tools.
Because I need to jump back because it's noon and I've got to get to another meeting, unfortunately. We could go on for many hours. Jordan, do you have a couple more you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, maybe why don't you just drop Chris and I'll
Okay.
do like one or two more and wrap us up.
All right. Sounds good. Ian, this was such an honor. Really enjoyed it. Looking forward to the episode once it's out. Take care.
All right. So I think like sort of it's hard to do the big sort of second guessing because there is so much unknown in 1941 and 42 about what carriers can do, what submarines can do, what the Japanese political system actually looks like. But coming back to submarines, right? Like if the US just 10x that effort, then there's a world in which many fewer people have to die because Japan decides to starve. Japan ends up starving, and then like that's sort of all she wrote. Island hopping is another kind of live debate of to what extent the U.S. could have skipped more islands. Iwo Jima, I think, being the main one that people still argue about today. What to you are the most interesting? Whether it's sort of operational strategy or broader open questions when it comes to the way the war was fought in the Pacific that you're excited to like see more historians take on.
Yeah, well, I would say I think there are a number of issues, but really what we found as we went along with this war was that we could go much faster, that we could close the ring around Japan much more quickly than we thought. And this is partly because I think we surprised ourselves with just how quickly we were able to mobilize our economy to get ships and troops and planes out into the Pacific. But I think if you were to refight the war, knowing what you knew in 1945, and if you were able to deal with the political challenge presented by MacArthur, who really was a sort of a force of nature all his own, who had the ability to shape decision making because of his political influence. I think probably what you would do is focus essentially all of your effort in a direct attack on Japan from Hawaii, moving directly through the Central Pacific, which is one of the routes we took, but not being diverted into the South Pacific to take islands within a bombing range of Japan and focused on essentially cutting their supply lines, with the submarines in particular, and then establishing the ability to bomb the Japanese homeland directly, which of course we did as well. I think if you took a much more sort of aggressive, close the ring around Japan quickly, I think you could probably see a scenario where the war ends 6 months earlier, and without even the necessity of using the atomic bomb. So that's counterfactual history, but I think if you went back and you really applied the lessons that you got from the war itself, if you were able to use that wisdom of hindsight as you were doing it, I think we could have seen a shorter war, a more efficient war, perhaps a war with fewer casualties, and that would force Hirohito and the ruling circle in Japan more quickly to a recognition that they had erred and they needed to surrender.
I don't know what's left for the Pacific War. Are there sort of as you were going through all this stuff, were there angles that you didn't end up exploring, or you still think are sort of rich, that haven't quite been covered yet?
Your podcast is devoted to China, right? So there are elements of this that we want to discuss that may bear on that.
Oh, the China stuff? Sure. Okay. You scared me off earlier. One of the
Well, I mean, I just at a high level, I say, I think, another kind of counterfactual within the Pacific that is often forgotten by people who are familiar with the history is that we came very, very close to landing troops in what we then called Formosa, and today we call Taiwan. And it was Admiral King and most of the Navy planners, at least in Washington, who really did believe this was the key to forcing an end to the war, was taking Taiwan, the island of Taiwan. And it was Raymond Spruance, who was the Fifth Fleet Commander, our ocean-going, fleet commander in the Western Pacific, who really took the lead in saying we should not take Taiwan. We should bypass Taiwan. We should take Okinawa. Okinawa is smaller. The island is large enough for our purposes, essentially to establish as a kind of a stepping stone to an invasion of Japan as an air base, but will not commit us to this enormous undertaking of taking this very large mountainous island that has been a Japanese colony for 50 years. And so, what if we had taken Taiwan? It's interesting to kind of imagine how the history might have unfolded. Would that have involved us in the Chinese Civil War, for example? And so, that's an interesting counterfactual. But, if and when China does seriously consider kind of rolling the dice and moving against Taiwan, it's going to encounter many of the same issues that led our military to decide not to take that step in 1944. It's a large, mountainous, rugged island. It would require you to establish, air supremacy over the island, naval supremacy at a beachhead, to be able to maintain a continuous flow of supplies over that beachhead. Taiwan is 100 miles from China. That's 5 times the width of the British Channel, the English Channel. And these are immense problems, which are not unlike some of the problems that we ended up solving in the 1940s, but should, I think, probably prompt military planners in China to think very seriously about this history, about the nature of the challenge.
Yeah, so we actually, I'll leave this in the show notes. We've ran 2 articles in the past year, one on the sort of debate around Operation Causeway, and the other Operation Show to Go, which is the Japanese kind of plan to ward off the Americans. And, they built all these, sort of relatively similar things that you saw in the context of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, with all these like holes and tunnels and whatnot. But so my take is like, I don't think Americans on Formosa changes a lot when it comes to the Chinese Civil War. And even the sort of, okay, the bomb doesn't happen or it happens late. Part of what Americans were thinking was like invading sort of Ningbo, like mainland China, and using that as a base to bomb Taiwan. But, the Americans did show up on mainland China after the war. And then afterwards, we were just like, all right, we're done. We're all going home. And then you have this sort of aborted attempt a few years later with Marshall trying to mediate and whatnot. And it just seems to me that, like, even if the Americans showed up in China, we would have pulled out really fast, just like we did in a lot of the rest of the Pacific. And the dynamic, I guess you would have to imagine a dynamic like one in Korea, where the U.S. but I think Korea only happens because the Chinese Civil War happens the way it does, and then everyone's like really on edge at that. Right. So sort of mobilizing America to do even more than what it did, which was already a lot when it came to giving Chiang Kai-shek a lot of weapons to fight in the late 1940s seems to me to be a hard counterfactual to sort of like weave my way into. I mean, I think it's more the Japanese sort of like invading in the first place, which gave Mao a shot. And but sort of, I don't know. Can you imagine the world in which like America really goes in with Chiang Kai-shek in like 46 and 47?
No, I mean, I think it's unlikely. I think the our military services really felt an immense sense of relief that we did not have to invade Japan, and really had shared a kind of a realization of just how costly that operation would be, and to become involved in a civil war in a vastly greater country on the mainland of Asia would have just compounded all of those issues. But counterfactuals are always going to be somewhat controversial. There are many historians who think they're not worth discussing at all. But so much happened in those last few weeks of the Pacific War that I think you're almost really forced to acknowledge that things could have gone differently. The Red Army pouring across the Manchurian border on August 9th, same day we hit Nagasaki, this kind of sudden declaration of war. Stalin's, letting this war machine loose in Manchuria. If the war had lasted 2 weeks longer, right, and the Japanese surrendered less than a week later, what if they had held out just to the end of August? Would you have had the Red Army in Korea in a bigger way? Stalin ordered his army to take Hokkaido. He wanted Hokkaido. He could have gotten Hokkaido if the war had gone on for a few more weeks. And then you might have seen Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, essentially as the kind of East Germany of Japan for 45 years through the Cold War. I think all of those kinds of counterfactuals you have to take seriously, given just how volatile the situation is, and the real question about whether Japan would surrender, whether it would make any sort of an organized decision at the end of the war at all, or whether the place would have sort of collapsed into civil war and preventing any sort of organized end of the Pacific War. Very, very different paths for Japan and for all of Asia, really, in those counterfactuals.
I mean, I think another lesson when we're talking about sort of like Taiwan contingency today is, we spoke earlier in this conversation about how the sort of like the die was already cast by January of 1942 because the sort of American industrial might was just what it was. But the sort of like the sort of balance of industrial forces plays out over longer time horizons in longer wars. And in shorter wars, the sort of importance of the sort of smaller technical decisions or kind of point in time technological advantages can really be amplified, such that you don't necessarily have these kind of like big like national industrial tests of will. And thankfully, we like haven't had too many of them when it comes to great powers going against each other really since 1945. So there's a lot more uncertainty, I think, in sort of these smaller wars where the like national commitment level is one of the most important variables which you're sort of gauging and adjusting for over time, as opposed to these two empires are going to go all out to the death against each other, and then you can really sort of like stack up the sort of the like factor endowments and have a pretty good sense of where it's all going to end up. So dark. I don't know. You want to recommend some books, Ian? I don't know. What have you read recently? It doesn't have to be anything to do with this. But whose writing has impressed you of late?
Well, I'll say In These Times, which is a book by Jenny Uglow about Great Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. I still have a real interest in in home front histories of all wars, the way societies deal with wars, the way they shape economies and politics. All of that, I think, is just a particularly fascinating subject for me. So, this book that I've been reading in these times, living in Britain through the Napoleonic Wars, 1793, 1815, by Jenny Uglo, really have been enjoying this book.
Okay. And maybe just some, like, are there voices or memoirs or letters? I mean, so many of these people who, like, so many of these Americans and Japanese who lived through the Pacific War, they're very stylish writers. I don't know. Which ones are the ones that stick with you these many years after writing this?
Well, I'd say Kurosawa's The Diary of Darkness. Kurosawa was a scholar who was sort of tarred as a liberal and marginalized in Japanese society. But it kept a daily diary through the end of the Pacific War that was just superb in terms of its observations of the way everyday life was unfolding for the Japanese at the same time. A sort of a scholar who knew a little bit about the politics. His horror is discussed at the way Japanese media coverage essentially manipulated. The Japanese people were being lied to. So that's a very good book that I think very few people have read. It's one of these books that was translated in I think in the 1960s, published. Virtually no one read it, and today it's almost entirely unknown. So that's one good example.
Great. And why don't you pick a U.S. memoir as well?
U.S. memoir, well, there really are many that are very good. There's a book by a fellow named Anthony Weller, who was an American correspondent who went into Japan immediately after the surrender. And his book is called First into Nagasaki, and it includes a lot of the dispatches he wrote at that time, which were quashed by the American censors, and so never saw the light of day. And the book is partly about his visit to Nagasaki in just a week after the surrender, but also there are a lot of dispatches there about Japan and about his interviews with freed American and British and Australian POWs. And just a terrific book. And again, one of these books that I just don't think has been very widely read, but is a kind of a neglected classic. That's Anthony Weller, First into Nagasaki.
Great. And I want to shout out a place. So Yakushima, I ended up making it to in February of 2020. It's this island off Kyushu. It is kind of like I was like stuck because China already had COVID and America didn't have COVID yet, and I was trying to still stay in Asia. And I'm really happy that Yakushima isn't sort of a place that now has to be associated like Okinawa or Iwo Jima as like a horrific battle happening there. It's one of the probably the most magical places I've ever been. It's this like giant rainforest.
So where Princess Mononoke, the animated film, was set?
Exactly. Yeah. They're just these enormous trees, and like it's really inconvenient to get to. There's not a lot of tourists. And America didn't have to invade it because I guess we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But like we're not in the worst of all possible timelines. The sort of the path where you have that invasion of Kyushu, and if a few more million people end up having to die is something that is really hanging over the specter of your final book. And I don't know. It's people should all go to Yakushima and be thankful that we haven't had another nuclear war since 1945.
Thank God.
What a weird way to end a show. Ian, this was a real treat. Thank you so much for writing this book. Give folks a preview. What's what are the few hundred pages you just threw out?
Well, I'm writing a book. My first book was called Six Frigates. It was about the founding of the U.S. Navy. So it's really the age of wooden ships and iron cannon, 150 years earlier than the Pacific War. And I'm writing a sequel to that book, which is about the naval campaign we fought against Britain on the Great Lakes between 1812 and 1815. That's called the Freshwater War. And I'll be done with that in about a year, and I'll probably take another year to publish it. So think about 2027 probably.
All right. Well, we will be sure to find a China tie-in to talk about the Freshwater War.
It may
Ian,
be labored.
yeah, we'll get there.
All right.
Thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Jordan, I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you, Chris.
sorry. Last thing. So we end every episode with a song. There were a handful of like generals that you shouted out for like really listening to this song or another. I don't know which one should I pick to take us out with?
Which song?
Yeah, I mean there were some like you were talking about the five senses earlier. Like at a number of points in the narratives, you have like Nimitz liking listen to this, or there was like a song that the Japanese all thought was this like the sappy tune that they flew out to battle for. Yeah.
The battleship. Till then, I think, among the American music of the Second World War, the Mills Brothers, Till Then, about lovers, a soldier and his wife being separated. It's a really quite a moving song, beautiful song.